I told you I'd kill him. I told you, didn't I?
You told me.
I had a right to. I'm gonna always wear this mark. And every time I look at it, I want to know I had the right to kill him.
If you hadn't done it, somebody else would have.
Now, you want to give me a lift?
Mr. McNally, you make a person feel awfully good.
Please, don't say comfortable.
Our bank holiday film tomorrow night on BBC1 features the first showing on British television of Fire. Ernest Borgnine heads the cast in this story of a forest fire that spreads out of control in the heart of Oregon's timberland. Fire tomorrow at 7:55. In 20 minutes, Roy Castle and Vince Hill share top billing in a programme of old-time music hall with the good old days from Leeds. And with the time now at 9:05, the news with Michael Burke.
"12 British servicemen were killed in the battle for Darwin and Goose Green, including Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, the Para's commanding officer. 31 were wounded. The Ministry of Defence say 1,400 Argentines were taken prisoner by 600 British troops. And it's confirmed tonight that British forces have entered Douglas Settlement and Teal Inlet on the northern route to Port Stanley. For the Pope, on the third day of his visit to Britain, another enthusiastic reception in Liverpool tonight, notably at the Anglican Cathedral. The battle for Goose Green, according to BBC correspondent Robert Fox, who was in the thick of it, was won by the dash and heroism of the men of the parachute regiment who fought and died there. It was, he said, the type of attack not seen since the last war. 600 British paratroops took on 1,400 Argentine troops in prepared defensive positions and after a fierce battle forced them to surrender. The Ministry of Defence said today that 12 British servicemen died, including the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones. He was killed leading an attack on a machine gun post that was holding up the advance. The Defence Ministry says 31 British soldiers were wounded in the battle. The Argentine prisoners, 120 of them injured, will be transferred to ships of the task force to be taken out of the area. In the north of the island, it's now been confirmed British troops have occupied the settlements of Douglas and Teal Inlet, though it's not known if there was any fighting there. 9 other British soldiers have been wounded in the drive east across the island. It appears some of the casualties occurred when British patrols accidentally fired on each other. In all cases, next of kin are being informed. Here, with his assessment, is our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
One of the most brilliant and courageous actions conducted by battalions since World War II. That's how the Battle of Goose Green was officially described today. Sources in Whitehall admitted they were astounded that 600 British soldiers managed to capture more than twice their own number of Argentines. When the attack started before dawn on Friday, the paratroops thought they were up against only 400 or 500 men at the most. They expected Darwin to fall quickly, and it did. But as they pressed forward, so the opposition became stiffer. By dawn, the Paras were under air attack, and blowpipe missiles were used to deal with half a dozen Argentine Pucara light bombers. The gunners shot down 4 out of 6 attacking aircraft. For their part, the Argentines shot down one British helicopter. As they crossed the open ground leading to the isthmus dividing Darwin from Goose Green, a position which couldn't be outflanked, the battalion ran into trouble.
As the Paras pressed on to the south, they met an increasingly strong defensive position, which was well dug in and sighted in depth. And at one stage they came under particularly intense fire from two heavy machine gun positions. And at this stage the attack could have faltered. Well up with these leading elements, Colonel Jones immediately took command of a small force and led attack against those machine guns. This attack was carried out with the utmost courage and determination, and it was successful, though sadly it resulted in the death of Colonel Jones, a most courageous commander at the head of his men.
We've received a graphic account of how Goose Green and Darwin were retaken by the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. Our reporter, Robert Fox, went in with the Paras. He sent his story as a telex message, and we asked Peter Main to read it.
The surrender came after a 14-hour battle the previous day. The attack began under naval gunfire, and shells lit the sky as the Paras moved forward. But in the daylight they were on their own, covered only by guns and mortars. The enemy were falling back slowly through prepared positions. At each post their own mortars had been arranged perfectly. Robert Fox says, time and again we were pinned down by mortars and fire from anti-aircraft guns. I was with the battalion headquarters, and if we were within 10 feet of death from shrapnel and shell once, we were there 40 times. In mid-afternoon we were told that the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, always known as H, had been shot as he led a platoon attack against machine gun nests which had held up the battalion for over half an hour. In the evening they brought his body down from the hillside, a soldier walking in front, his weapon pointed to the ground. The silhouette of this silent ceremony, the most indelible image of the day. When the Argentine soldiers surrendered the next day, there were whoops of joy from one group as they threw their weapons down. They were glad to be going home, they said. Senior British officers watching were amazed at the numbers, nearly 3 times the strength of the ground forces they had been led to expect in the area. For nearly a month, 114 people had been shut up by the Argentines in the settlement community hall. Their houses had been raided, with furniture smashed and excrement on the floor. The Argentines committed acts of petty meanness, smashing and stealing radios and shooting up a shepherd from a helicopter as he tended his sheep. Now the prisoners are being made to clear up the mess they made in the settlement. Robert Fox says at the end of his report that the liberation of Goose Green was due above all to the courage of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. They carried out a type of attack not seen since the last war, and its success was due to the dash and heroism of the men who fought and died.
Perhaps I could sum up this operation by making 3 points. First, that although the Argentinians undoubtedly fought hard and well, 1,400 men in well-prepared positions were outfought
by a magnificent battalion
of some 600 parachutists. Second, the lives of the Falkland Islanders in that area are safe. And third, in my view, this is one of the most brilliant and courageous battalion actions which has been conducted since the end of World War II. And all of those of us in the armed forces salute to Para.
Of the 10,000 soldiers and Marines originally under General Menendez's command, 1,400 are now prisoners of war and 1,500 are cut off on West Falkland. That leaves 7,000 at Stanley. They've been isolated from all direct contact with Argentina for more than a week, and the constant naval and aerial bombardment must have taken its toll. In the north, the Royal Marines have taken the tiny settlements at Douglas and Teal Inlet, thus opening up the northern route to the Argentine defensive perimeter around Stanley. This week should see the battle for the Falklands reach its climax. The Argentines are getting plenty of vocal support from Buenos Aires, but precious little else.
Like the rest of the government here, the Foreign Minister, Costa Mendes, was deaf to questions about the latest events. In his case, he claimed it was because he'd just stepped off a flight from the United Nations. But there's been no public government response to the loss of Port Darwin and Goose Green, although the junta met for 2 hours last night to discuss the Argentine reverses. But for all the official silence, the Argentine public are now well aware that things in the islands are definitely not going the way the military junta here had led them to believe they would. The papers here talk of the heroic defense put up by the Argentine forces against superior numbers before they had to surrender. But the flowery language can't hide the fact that the British troops won an important victory in Port Darwin and Goose Green and are now moving forward towards their main objective, the Falkland Islands capital. And both the public and the junta here know that the future of the islands isn't the only thing that will depend on the outcome of that battle. The very future of the military government here could also be decided. These pictures taken by an Argentine cameraman within the last few days show the type of training the armed forces here have been going through in the south of the country near Comodoro Rivadavia. The battle for Port Stanley is the one for which Argentina has been preparing since the invasion of the Falkland Islands at the beginning of April. The government here has known all along that the biggest British assault they would have to face would be at Port Stanley. So that's where most of the Argentine troops and weapons and equipment have been positioned. Argentina has been playing up the fact that their men around the Falklands capital are fresh and waiting for battle, unlike the British troops, who they claim will be weary after the fighting they've already been through. But what they've not mentioned, however, is the effect on the morale of the two sets of troops, one moving forward after significant successes, the other dug in and waiting for that force to come to them.
The Colonel-in-Chief of the Parachute Regiment, Prince Charles, has sent his congratulations to the men who recaptured Goose Green and expressed his sympathy for the loss of Colonel Jones. The Colonel, who was 42, left a wife and 2 boys. They went with him to Buckingham Palace when he received the OBE last year. Gary Lloyd asked a former colleague of Colonel Jones to describe him.
H. Jones, as we knew him, was a strong, vibrant chap, full of charisma, wonderful chap, great leader, and I think if one had met H. Jones for just 1 minute of one's life, one would always remember him.
He was described as a man who believed in leading from the front. Is that an accurate description?
It is. H. Jones had a great love for everything military, and in operations, it's the job of the commander to make sure that things are going well forward. And H would want that to be so. And he'd want to be up there in the front, not actually leading the battle, but offering support and encouragement to the young officers and his NCOs and the soldiers as well.
The pilot of the Harrier, shot down over Goose Green on Thursday, is safely back with British forces. He's squadron leader Bob Iverson, the son of a distinguished World War II bomber pilot. After he'd ejected and landed behind Argentine lines, he spotted a military patrol and, as he put it, ran off in the other direction. He came to a Falklanders' house which was unoccupied, and as he found food and blankets inside, he slept the night there. In the morning, he walked back towards the British sector and heard and saw the battle for Goose Green. After hearing a helicopter, and was confident it was British, he fired his identification flare and was picked up. A memorial service has been held for the men killed on the frigate Ardent in Milford Haven, the ship's adopted home. She was sunk 8 days ago with the loss of 22 lives, and another 30 men were injured. Gareth Knowles reports.
800 people, including naval representatives from Plymouth and that city's Lord Mayor, marched slowly through the main streets of Milford Haven. The town had adopted the Ardent as soon as she was commissioned 5 years ago. In the congregation were local families who'd had relatives aboard. The service brought those with just friendly links too, close to tears. But the prayers of the Mayor's chaplain, the Reverend G.R. Price, weren't exclusively for HMS Ardent.
Let us pray for the Spirit of Christ, that we may learn magnanimity of heart, that we may remember the bereaved and injured in Argentina. They too share the capacity of suffering that is the lot of men.
The Pope travelled to the Midlands and Merseyside today and made renewed pleas for world peace to the enthusiastic crowds that welcomed him everywhere. At Coventry Airport, at an open-air mass attended by nearly 400,000 people, he declared, "Modern warfare is totally unacceptable as a means of settling differences between nations." Later, in Liverpool, where he visited both the Anglican and Roman Catholic cathedrals, he spoke of the tragedy of unemployment. Pope John Paul's day began with an emotional meeting with Britain's Polish community at Crystal Palace in London. Here he told his fellow countrymen
that Poland was a land
deeply furrowed by suffering. The Pope's schedule is unrelenting. Shortly after 7 this morning, his helicopter was in the air again, heading for Crystal Palace. The stadium was jammed with 20,000 of his fellow Poles, about 1 in 5 of Britain's Polish community. They'd brought with them their placards supporting Solidarity, the union now suppressed by Poland's military government. But this was not a political rally, more a celebration of the unique identity of Poles everywhere. When the Pope finally arrived in the stadium, the emotion was tangible, strong enough even to pierce the bulletproof glass there to protect him from assassination attempts. The bouquets came from Polish children in their national dress. When the Pope moved in to mingle with his fellow countrymen, they sang, "May you live 100 years," a song that seemed to have no end.
If the Crystal Palace event was something of a private occasion, then the visit to Coventry was one of the most colourful and moving spectacles this part of Christendom had ever seen. No sooner had the Pope arrived than he was making his way past the 600 corrals in which many of the faithful had stood for up to 19 hours. This was the blessing they'd come to receive, and for 40 minutes the Pope Mobile slowly made its way along scores of avenues, bearing the names of saints and which had been transformed into a sea of yellow and white. Then at last it was time for the Mass of Pentecost to begin. A moment's rest for the Pope, his face creased by tiredness and concentration. A blind lady from a Midlands parish read one of the lessons.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. No one can say that Jesus is Lord unless he is under the influence of the Holy Spirit.
In a city which had suffered the devastation of war, the Pope's plea was for peace and reconciliation.
Today, the scale and the horror of modern warfare, whether nuclear or not, makes it totally unacceptable as a means of settling differences between nations. War should belong to the tragic past, to history.
After the homily, 26 members of the open-air congregation offered themselves for confirmation. Not all taking this significant step of faith were young, though one of them, Marie-Jean Chatness, is just 11. She said she'd been thrilled for weeks at the prospect of being confirmed by the Holy Father. Umbrellas were used to shade the priests from the sunshine as they moved out to offer communion, and the Mass drew to a close.
In Liverpool, the two great cathedrals stand within sight of each other, Anglican and Catholic sharing a mutual respect which in the past has been more a hope than a reality. When he arrived, 25 minutes behind schedule, Pope John Paul well knew the city's sectarian history. If he didn't, the Reverend Ian Paisley was there to remind him. And so were some of his Protestant anti-Pope supporters. As it happened, Mr. Paisley was perfectly placed for a papal blessing. But at the Anglican Cathedral, the old hostilities were largely forgotten. Bishop David Shepherd, who greeted the Pope personally, has worked hard with the Catholic Archbishop Warlock to forge a special bond between their two churches in Liverpool. For the second time on this trip, the Pope entered a Church of England. A Whit Sunday service was coming to an end, and Bishop Shepherd said that as a joint act of celebration, it would be no mere window dressing. And it seemed he was right. They greeted him, welcomed him, embraced him like a long-lost friend. It was like nothing ever seen in this great cathedral, and none of it was in the order of service. Even the bishops were moved to applaud. It was the kind of reception Liverpool usually reserves for successful football teams. John Paul beamed with pleasure. A brief but memorable encounter, and then on down the appropriately named Hope Street to his own flock, waiting at the Catholic Cathedral in the warm afternoon sunshine. It was from Liverpool that pressure to invite the Pope was most active, the result of a unique National Pastoral Congress 2 years ago. The Congress had some radical things to say about English Catholicism and changed its tone in a way that Pope John Paul may not entirely approve of. But it was here too that the word conciliation took on a more secular meaning. The riots in nearby Toxteth divided the community in a new direction, the police and the young. And it was for that reason that the youth event held later tonight at the rear of the Catholic Cathedral had a special significance.
A day then of war and of peace. That's all from me. Newsnight on BBC2 just after 11 o'clock will have a special report on the Pope's visit, and also, of course, the latest on the Falklands conflict as British troops advance towards the capital, Port Stanley.
Now the weather. Most places will have a dry and very warm day again tomorrow with a good deal of sunshine. In southern parts, high cloud will make the sunshine hazy, and this may well thicken sufficiently to give some showery rain in places, especially early and late in the day. Temperatures will reach 24 centigrade, 75 Fahrenheit over a good deal of the country, but eastern and southern coasts will become cooler as well as misty from time to time. And that's the weather.
Entertainment for the Spring Bank Holiday Monday on
BBC1. At 6:15, Jim fixes it for a Glasgow boy to sing with his favourite group, Tight Fit.
And for some young ladies to take an unusual ride on a rail trolley. At 6:55, Triangle.
And Captain John Anderson is faced with an unpleasant possibility.
Sabotage? It has to be, John. 8 1.5-inch nuts do not undo themselves.
At 7:20,
Kids into that. At 7:55, Fire, the story of a spectacular forest blaze starring Ernest Borgnine and Vera Miles.
Come on, get everybody out here, let's go. Okay.
At 9:50 after the news, Night of 100 Stars. A gala evening from New York.